Most readers tend to think of Tolkien as a distant figure when it comes to film, an author who simply never lived to see Middle-earth on screen. For many, this part of the legendarium feels unresolved, almost neutral, as though Tolkien left no clear judgment on what cinema might do to his work. Yet buried in his letters and private commentary is a far more complicated reaction, one shaped not by ignorance of film, but by a deep unease with how stories are transformed once they leave the page. Long before Peter Jackson, Tolkien was already confronting scripts, treatments, and proposals that disturbed him profoundly. Once you notice how sharply he responded to these early attempts, it becomes difficult to see modern adaptations as a clean break from his world. Something older is already at work here. So for a moment, let us slow down and observe the shadows Tolkien himself saw gathering at the edges of Middle-earth. That's what we will explore in today's video. But before we continue, if you're new here or haven't subscribed yet, consider subscribing, as it really helps the channel out. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. With that said, we return not to cinemas or special effects, but to a quiet Oxford study, where Tolkien weighed the fate of his sub-created world with visible reluctance. Tolkien was not hostile to storytelling beyond the written word. He loved illustration, valued performance, and admired myth in all its forms. What troubled him was not adaptation itself, but distortion, especially when that distortion arose from haste, simplification, or commercial appetite. He felt a personal responsibility to Middle-earth, not as its owner, but as its steward. To alter it carelessly was, in his mind, a kind of betrayal. This sense of guardianship developed slowly, shaped by decades of labor. By the time The Lord of the Rings was published in the mid-1950 seconds, Tolkien was no longer merely inventing a story. He was maintaining a history, one that stretched from the music of the Ainur to the fading of the elves, bound together by language, chronology, and moral consequence. Any attempt to translate that history into another medium would have to contend with its full weight. In a 1958 letter responding to a proposed film treatment, Tolkien wrote with unusual sharpness, criticizing what he called a careless and incompetent handling of the material. This was not casual disappointment, it was alarm. The central question of this episode is not whether Tolkien would have liked modern films. It is deeper than that. Why did Tolkien react so strongly to early film adaptations, and what does that reaction reveal about how he understood Middle-earth itself? The possibility of a film adaptation emerged surprisingly early. By the late 1950 seconds, The Lord of the Rings had achieved enough success to attract interest from filmmakers, particularly in the United States. Tolkien, cautious but pragmatic, sold the film rights in 1969, largely for financial security. But before that sale, he was already evaluating creative proposals. The most significant of these came from Morton Grady Zimmerman, who produced a screenplay treatment in the late 1950 seconds. Tolkien was asked to review it. What followed was one of the most revealing critical documents Tolkien ever wrote, a line-by-line demolition of the script preserved in his letters. This was not the reaction of a man unfamiliar with cinema. Tolkien understood the need for compression and visual storytelling. His objections were philosophical, linguistic, and moral. He believed the treatment misunderstood not only the plot, but the very tone of Middle-earth. Zimmerman's script attempted to condense The Lord of the Rings into a form Tolkien found almost unrecognizable. Characters were altered in temperament, scenes rearranged for spectacle, and moments of quiet moral tension replaced with crude action. Tolkien objected not only to what was added, but to what was lost. One of his strongest reactions concerned the portrayal of the hobbits. He felt they were treated as comic relief rather than moral anchors. The hobbits, in Tolkien's conception, were essential precisely because of their ordinariness. Their resistance to domination arose from humility, not heroism. Turning them into caricatures undermined the entire ethical structure of the story. Tolkien was equally disturbed by the handling of language. Names were altered, dialogue flattened, and the musicality of speech, so central to his world, was ignored. For Tolkien, language was not decoration. It was history made audible. To mishandle it was to erase the past. Perhaps most telling was his reaction to the treatment of the ring itself. The script emphasized its external danger, but failed to convey its slow, inward corrosion. Tolkien feared that cinema, in careless hands, would reduce the ring to a mere plot device, rather than a moral presence. He wrote that certain scenes displayed a wholly evil-minded frivolity, a phrase that reveals his deepest anxiety, that the sacred and the trivial were being confused. Middle-earth was not meant to be solemn at all times, but it was never meant to be cheap. Yet Tolkien did not reject adaptation outright. He acknowledged that film required alteration. What he demanded was respect for causality, for tone, and for the internal logic of the world. Without those, the story might remain recognizable in outline, but it would be hollow. To understand Tolkien's reaction, it helps to look back to his earlier writings. In the Book of Lost Tales, Middle-earth was more fluid, more experimental. Characters shifted. Stories contradicted one another. Tolkien later disciplined this chaos, refining his mythology into a coherent history. By the time of The Lord of the Rings, he had become deeply protective of that coherence. Adaptations that treated the story as a collection of scenes rather than a lived chronology violated something fundamental. They returned Middle-earth to a prehistorical state, undoing decades of careful subcreation. Tolkien's critique was also theological, though rarely stated outright. He believed that stories carry moral weight through restraint. Evil in Middle-earth is seductive precisely because it is not always loud. Film, he feared, would externalize what should remain internal. This explains why his objections were so detailed. He was not nitpicking. He was defending a philosophy of storytelling in which meaning arises from structure, not spectacle. Tolkien's reaction reminds us that Middle-earth was never designed to be consumed quickly. Its power lies in accumulation, in the slow layering of loss, memory, and choice. When that patience is stripped away, the world may still look familiar, but it no longer feels ancient. The ripple effects of this tension are still felt today. Every adaptation of Tolkien exists in dialogue, not only with the books, but with Tolkien's own resistance. His warnings shape how fans argue, how filmmakers justify changes, and how Middle-earth is defended as something more than fantasy entertainment. What Tolkien might have thought of modern films remains unknowable. He never saw them, and left no guidance for worlds he could not imagine. That silence is not accidental. It preserves Middle-earth as a living history rather than a finished product. In that absence, interpretation becomes responsibility. And responsibility, Tolkien believed, is where meaning truly begins. Tolkien did not fear adaptation because it changed his story. He feared it because it might forget why the story mattered at all. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe and leave a like. And I'll see you in the next one.